It always starts the same way. A quiet town, a missing piece, and a story no one wants to tell.
But murder doesn't hide forever. It leaves fingerprints on time and blood in places you wouldn't expect.
We don't just retell the cases. We dig through the lies, the loopholes, and the long-forgotten whispers.
Because the truth doesn't knock. It kicks the door in, and it never comes alone.
Someone pulled the trigger, and someone's still hiding. We are Truth and Trigger. Alright, let's start where it all begins. Boston, 1960s, a city known for its historical charm, its lively streets, and its iconic Boston accents. But underneath that lively atmosphere, something dark is growing. It was the beginning of a mystery that would leave people on edge for years.
Exactly. This was no ordinary case. 13 women were found dead in their homes, each strangled with stockings, their lives violently taken. The victims, most of them were housewives. They were chosen at random, and so it seemed, no one knew who was behind it. As if the city was a soul being pulled away piece by an invisible hand.
And that's the thing. The Strangler wasn't a careless killer. He knew what he was doing. He was methodical. Each victim was killed in a way that suggested control. No chaos, just a cold, calculated precision. No struggle, no fight, just a quiet end in the dark corners of their home.
The thing about murder is that it doesn't just disappear. It leaves a mark, a scar, on the place that it happened. And this scar had the city gripped in fear. What was worse, though, was the feeling that this was just the beginning. The murder started, and no one could figure out who was behind them. People feared that the killer could be anyone. Could be your neighbor, your coworker, a friend even.
And for a while, the police didn't know what they were dealing with. They thought it might be one person at first, but then something started to change. They couldn't even confirm if the deaths were linked, so they kept it quiet, tried to solve it on their own. But with each new body, the case became bigger than they could handle. The fear spread throughout the city, and as much as they wanted to deny it, everyone knew. They had a serial killer on their hands.
That's when Albert Desalvo's name came into the picture. It wasn't just his criminal history that drew attention, but his odd behavior. At first, it didn't make sense. How could a guy like Desalvo be involved? His rap sheet was filled with petty thefts and assaults. He had no history of violent crimes, but it was the timing that made people look twice.
Then, right when the cops were about to lose hope, they get a tip. DeSalvo's name. But at that point, they didn't have any evidence, no hard facts, just a gut feeling. A hunch. And that hunch led them straight to DeSalvo, a guy who's been in and out of the system, whose presence was starting to become unavoidable.
Now, let's not be mistaken here. DeSalvo wasn't the only suspect. But there was something about him that made the investigators think, maybe, just maybe, he's our guy. What they didn't know was that this case would turn into a bigger enigma than anyone would ever imagine.
It wasn't just the crimes that kept people up at night, it was the fear that the killer could be anyone, and that anyone might be hiding right next to you. In a city as tight-knit as Boston, that was a terrifying thought. The Strangler was out there, somewhere lurking, and the truth was getting harder and harder to find.
So, here's when things get interesting. After months of investigation, Albert Desalvo, a man with history of lesser crimes, suddenly confesses to be the Boston Strangler. But what does the confession really mean? Is it proof, or is it just a piece of a puzzle that leads us down the wrong path?
You'd think after months of fear and panic, this would be the break the cops needed. But when DeSalvo stepped up to confess, everything got confusing. His confession wasn't clean, it wasn't clear-cut, and it certainly wasn't solid as you'd expect someone admitting to a crime this big. He wasn't giving straight answers, there was holes in his story, gaps in his timeline, and it didn't match up with the crime scenes at all.
That's the first big problem here. DeSalvo described the crime scenes in detail, but some of those details didn't add up. For example, he mentioned that the victims were tied up, but the autopsy revealed no sign of restraints. He also described them being killed with scarves, but in fact, all the victims were strangled with stockings. Those two discrepancies alone made you wonder, how could he have known about the murders in such detail if he wasn't actually there?
It's as if DeSalvo was trying to create a story that fit the puzzle, but the pieces didn't quite fit together. There were parts of his confession that felt almost like he was making them up, as if he went along, things he might have learned from the news or rumors.
Why confess? If he wasn't the strangler, why confess to something so gruesome? He was desperate for attention, maybe? Was he trying to claim fame for something he didn't or did do? Or was he genuinely trying to clear his conscience, even if the truth didn't quite align with the facts?
Some people believe he wasn't trying to get attention at all. They think he was just a guy who wanted to be a part of something bigger than himself. Remember, DeSalvo had a pretty low-profile life up until this point, He wasn't famous, he wasn't anyone's idea of a criminal mastermind, but confessing to being the Boston Strangler would have put him on the map in a way he never could have imagined.
Let's not forget, he was confessing to a crime while sitting in a jail cell, already arrested for a different crime. Maybe he was trying to use the confession to get some kind of deal or leniency to leverage the bargaining chip on the situation that didn't seem to be going his way.
That's the thing, though. The police were desperate. They wanted to close the case. They needed closure, and Desalvo gave them exactly what they were looking for, a confession. But even though the confession had the details, there were too many things that didn't add up. And the more you look at it, the more you realize maybe this confession was a bit too perfect. Maybe he wasn't the guy.
So, we're left with the question, was Desalvo the Strangler? Or was he simply the guy who wanted to be? Was he caught up in something that wasn't his own? Or was he just another pawn in a bigger game? Now let's talk about the evidence, or should I say the lack of it. When it comes to a case like this, you expect the police to have something solid, something that ties the suspect to the crime. But in Desalvo's case, the evidence didn't match with the confession at all, and that's a serious problem.
Think about it. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could have identified or linked Desalvo to the victims. And for a guy who was allegedly the Boston Strangler, someone responsible for all those murders, you'd expect something, anything, but the scene was too clean. Almost like the killer had planned it out perfectly.
That was where it gets frustrating. How could someone commit so many murders and leave no trace behind? It's possible Desalvo was just incredibly careful, but that's hard to believe. It's hard to buy that someone could pull off all these murders without leaving any clues at all.
But then we have to look at the modern day evidence. DNA testing didn't match Desalvo's DNA for the samples found at the crime scene. In fact, after decades of testing, there was nothing to link him to the murders at all. So does this mean Desalvo is innocent?
Not necessarily. Even though DNA testing didn't match, it's possible that things were planted or that the real killer was just that good. We can't rule anything out, but the fact that modern science couldn't link him to the crimes raises serious doubts about his involvement.
And don't forget, we're still dealing with the case that was investigated in the 60s, a time when forensic science wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now. What if Desalvo was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, one that was too complex for the cops to solve back then?
But ignore that possibility. The lack of evidence doesn't prove Desalvo's innocence, but it doesn't prove his guilt either. What does it make us wonder? Is the truth still out there? And if so, will we ever find it? Now that we've talked about the scene and the confession, let's get on to the theories. When a case like this hits the public, you're gonna get all kinds of speculation. People love a good theory, especially when there's a mystery involved. And Desalvo? Well, he sparked some of the most wild theories in true crime history.
Let's start with the obvious one. Is Desalvo the real Boston Strangler? The confession fits with the timeline. He gave enough detail to convince some people. At first glance, it seems like it makes sense. But when you dig deeper, the evidence starts to crumble. The lack of hard evidence and the inconsistencies in the story, it casts some doubts.
And here's where it gets interesting. Some people believe that Desalvo was just a copycat, that maybe he didn't start the killings, but saw an opportunity to take credit for something bigger. Maybe the real killer was already out there, and Desalvo, being the opportunist he was, jumped in and confessed that he was and when he saw his chance.
Right. It's like he was trying to claim the spotlight. Maybe he thought the cops were getting close to the real killer and wanted to be the one to take the credit. We've seen this before in true crime, people confessing to crimes they didn't commit, just to get some sort of attention. Could Desalvo have been the Boston Strangler in his own mind, but not in reality?
And there's the theory that he was involved, but only at the start. Maybe Desalvo didn't kill all the victims. Maybe he only killed the first one, and then someone else took over. This theory would explain the inconsistencies in his confession, that maybe he was just a small part of the larger story, and the real killer? They just stay hidden in the shadows, letting Desalvo take the fall.
And don't forget the theory that Desalvo was just a pawn. Maybe he was the guy who got caught up in a much bigger game, and somebody else was pulling the strings all along. Maybe the Strangler wasn't just one person, but a duo, a group, or even more. If that's true, it would make sense why the cops could never find enough evidence to pin the crimes on Desalvo.
And of course, there's the possibility that Desalvo wasn't involved at all. Maybe the real killer is still out there, and Desalvo was just the guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That would explain his confession and why it was so flawed, and if he was just a convenient scapegoat.
It's a mess. There are just so many layers to this case, but what we know for sure is that no one has been able to piece the whole story together. Desalvo's confession didn't give us closure, and the evidence didn't back up the story he told. So the question remains, who was really the Boston Strangler?
The Desalvo case didn't just end with his confession. It made the subject of a debate, public speculation, and legal battles for years. Once the confession was made, It seemed like the case was closed. But what happened after that? What was the fallout of Desalvo's claims?
Well, for one, people started questioning the whole investigation. How did they go so long without catching the Strangler, and why did they latch on to Desalvo as a prime suspect despite the glaring holes in his case? The public wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of a man confessing to something that he might not have done, and the frustration led to more scrutiny of the Boston Police Department.
The police were desperate for answers. They had a city in panic, and they wanted closure. But instead of solidifying the case with the irrefutable evidence, they relied on the confession that didn't hold up. It's no surprise that people began to ask questions of the legitimacy of the whole thing.
Then, there's the issue of Desalvo's own fate. He was never charged with the Boston Strangler murders, but he did spend time in jail for other crimes. He was ultimately stabbed to death in prison in 1973. Was it a random act of violence, or was someone silencing him before he could reveal more about the truth?
We'll never know. But his death left so many questions unanswered. Was he trying to protect someone, or was he just unlucky? Either way, it added another layer of mystery to an already complex case.
The fallout didn't just affect Desalvo, it changed the way people viewed the justice system. It raised questions about how cases were handled, how suspects were treated, and how evidence was gathered. After all, we still don't know for sure if Desalvo was the killer, and there's a chance that the real Strangler walked free.
What about the families of the victims? How were they affected by the whole thing? Were they satisfied with Desalvo's confession, or did they feel cheated, knowing that there was so much uncertainty around his involvement?
For the families, this was an emotional roller coaster. One moment they were hearing the killer had been caught, the next they were left with more questions than answers. And then Desalvo was murdered in prison. It was like the final chapter of an already tragic story had been sealed without a conclusion. It's been decades since Albert Desalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, but the case still haunts us. The legacy of this case isn't just the crime itself, but the questions that continue to raise about justice, truth, and the way we tell stories.
The case really sets the stage for how we think about confessions and the role they play in criminal investigations. Think about it. The Boston Strangler case is one of the earliest examples of a case where someone confessed to a string of murders but didn't quite understand the details and they didn't add up. It changed the way that we look at confessions in general and the legal impacts that they still have on criminal investigations.
And that's not just in the world of true crime. The case left its mark on pop culture too. The Boston Strangler became this infamous figure, a symbol of fear, mystery, and unknown. Books, documentaries, movies, and everyone had their own take on the case. And that's the thing. With true crime, it's not just about the facts. It's about those facts that are interpreted, twisted, and ultimately retold.
The legacy of the Boston Strangler is also about how we deal with the cases that remain unsolved. The people that are still fascinated by it, at the end of the day, they don't have closure. We still don't know who the real killer was, and that mystery is a powerful thing. It keeps people coming back to the story over and over, trying to make sense of something that will never fully be made sense of.
And as we dive deeper into the world of unsolved mysteries and that one who got away, it's important to remember that sometimes the answers aren't as easy to find as we think. The Boston Strangler case is proof of that.
Actually, and that's why we keep coming back. We hope that someday maybe we'll get the answers we've been looking for. But for now, the mystery remains. And that, in itself, is a legacy.
So after everything we've looked at, what's the final word? Was Albert Desalvo the Boston Strangler, or was he just another man caught in the web of lies? A victim of his own confession?
For sure. And that's the unsettling truth about cases like these. Sometimes the answers just don't come. Sometimes the stories remain incomplete.
Here's what we do know. This case will always be one of those that makes you think. It's a reminder that things aren't always as simple as they seem. Sometimes the truth is tangled up in confusion, and no matter how much we dig, we might never be able to get the whole picture.
Our mysteries are never as clear as we want them to be. And maybe that's the way they should be. Because if we had all the answers, what would we have left to question? What would we have left to explore?
And so, as the story of Albert Desalvo, a Boston Strangler, fades into the past, we're left with the same question we started with. Who really did it?
Maybe that's the only thing we'll never know for sure.
Another closed chapter, or maybe just cracked open. Because around here, the truth never comes clean.
It's in blood. It echoes in silence. And every time we pull the trigger, something else gets buried.
Tonight made you look over your shoulder? Good. That means the story is getting under your skin.
Don't forget to follow Truth and Trigger wherever you get your podcasts. Rate, review, you know the drill. The more ears we have, the louder the whisper gets. This was Truth and Trigger. Sleep tight.